don't know how true it actually is, but there's a popular perception that goldfish have a really short memory span. There are countless jokes that are only funny because they're based on this idea. And if you accuse someone of having the memory of a goldfish, we all know that you're not remarking on their ability to remember a whole lot of stuff. Well, I've decided that if I were to get a pet goldfish anytime soon, I would have to name him Abraham. We can read a lot about Abraham in the Bible, and not just in the Old Testament. His story resonates and reverberates. He is commended for his faith, and yet we see in Abraham a man who often falters and doubts, and sometimes who tries to become the engineer of God's promises rather than the recipient. He gets impatient and tries to push to make the things happen that he wants to happen. He forgets. He needs to be reminded of God's commitment to him and of all that God has promised him. There are many times when Abraham's memory falls short, and yet every time this happens, every time he seems to stop and get stuck and forget, God draws near to remind and to reassure, and to enable him to put one foot in front of the other and step forwards, move onwards in faith once more. The reading from Genesis today begins, "After these things." It's always good when you get a passage like this because you know you can't just focus on the bit in hand. You know you need to look at what has happened before. Well, in my Bible, I only have to turn back one page because we only really embark on the story of Abraham, or Abram as he is known at that time, in chapter 12. God has called Abram to set out towards an unknown destination with the promise that he will be the father of a great nation. He will be blessed, and his greatness will not be for his own benefit, but so that he will be a blessing to the rest of the world. That's quite a promise and quite a responsibility to be starting out with. So Abram travels and pitches his tent and builds altars in gratitude to God. There's a short but action-packed spell in Egypt, but Abram travels onwards. In chapter 13 we read that he has a lot of livestock and silver and gold, and his travelling party would have been pretty large. In fact, the people who were looking after his livestock fall into conflict with the ones looking after his nephew Lot's livestock, and so Abram and Lot decide to go their separate ways. God renews the promise to Abram. Then in chapter 14 there is a war. Lot is taken prisoner and Abram embarks on a rescue mission. This is successful and the liberation of a whole lot of captives is secured. In gratitude, Abram is given a blessing and offered riches. He refuses the riches. And then God comes to him again, and this is where we pick up the story today. God says, "Don't be afraid, Abram. I'm looking after you." It's as though God is saying, "I know you just come through a really difficult time, but you don't need to be scared. I was with you then, and I'm with you now, and you're going to be great." But Abram isn't so sure. He seems less conscious of the way God has brought him through recent trials and tribulations, and much more fixated on what God hasn't done. "Well," he says to God, "you might say that. You might say that I'm going to be a great nation, but how is it going to happen? You promised me children, but time is really pushing on and there's no sign of them. I'm not getting any younger, and it looks as though I'll have to make the child of one of my slaves my heir." Abram's confidence in God wavers. He remembers what has been promised, children, but he forgets the nature of the one who has made the promise. He forgets God's promise of faithfulness and he starts making his own plans for the succession. If God can't deliver, what does he, Abram, need to do to make sure that his name and his household perpetuate into the future? "Come outside with me," says God, "and I'll show you what I mean." God is always offering the bigger picture to Abram, always gently reminding him, especially when he begins to doubt. The promise is restated and renewed. Whereas in chapter 12, the promise was simply to be a great nation, in chapter 13, God gets a bit more specific. It's as though Abram can't quite grasp what God means, so God needs a metaphor, an illustration to try and help Abram visualize it. "Look at all the dust of the earth," God says. "There is so much that you can't begin to count each individual speck of it. This is what your family will be like. This is what my promise means." Here in chapter 15, Abram doubts again. And again God tries to help him imagine what the promise means, what it looks like. Look up at the night sky and try and count the stars. You can't do it, can you? Well, this is what your family will be like, more numerous than the stars. And Abraham believes and trusts, for now at least. And if we were to keep reading on, Abraham is reminded of the promise again in chapter 17, and this time, to make it more concrete, God gives Abraham a new name. The name Abraham means ancestor, but the name Abraham takes it to a whole new level. Abraham, not just any old ancestor, but the ancestor of a multitude. If the visual images are not enough to hold on to, then the new name is a constant reminder of what God has promised. Until it actually happens, Abraham wavers between belief and trust and doubt and forgetfulness, often asking God how things will come to pass, how the promise will be kept, and needing to be reminded over and over again that he can only see part of the story, but that God sees it all. We often need to be reminded of the bigger picture too. It can be easy to get so bogged down in the messiness and minutiae of life that we forget God's promises of love, faithfulness, provision, new life, transformation and blessing. Or we might remember that these things are promised, but we lose heart because we don't feel we're getting them quickly enough or in the way that we imagine they will come. We need to be reminded of the story of Abraham because it helps us to remember and to understand that our idea of how things should be is not always the same as God's. We might only see one chapter or one page at a time of the story in which we find ourselves, but God holds the whole book. Or we're trying to put together a jigsaw puzzle and the bits we can see seem only to be a load of vague colours and shapes, but God can see the whole picture, the whole amazing, intricate, beautiful picture, the picture of which we are a part. God calls us all onwards and outwards like Abraham. God calls us to remember and to trust and to journey on, to keep on seeking a homeland, that better country that the writer of the letter to the Hebrews describes. As my time in this circuit comes to an end, I must admit that I feel a bit like Abraham. I've travelled here with you for the last 11 years. I can look back at times of growth and blessing and at times of doubt and uncertainty. I can look back at promises I've forgotten and constant reminders from God who has always been with me. I've lost count of the number of times I've thought God should do things my way, or when I've challenged God about what on earth is going on. I've pitched my tent in various places around the circuit over the years. I'm blessed to have had so many reasons to build altars of thankfulness. There have been battles and challenges, things that have troubled and bruised and changed me, but the blessings, thank God, have been so many more. I've tried to be a faithful servant to God, and sometimes I've been better at it than others. I've followed and I've questioned. I've flown on the eagle-wing promises of God's strength and comfort and support, and I've faltered when I've lost sight of where God is at work and thought that somehow it was all about me. Thank you for walking with me through these years, for all that you have taught me and for the many ways you have loved and blessed me. For each one of us, the future is going to be new and different and unknown. We will all face strange and as yet unidentifiable challenges. We will all need to be reminded of God's promises of love and faithfulness, of strength and comfort, of new life and transformation, because no doubt there will be times when we forget, or when we think we can work it all out for ourselves. God has said to me so many times, come outside with me for a while and look at the stars. I'm grateful for those frequent reminders of my place in God's universe and God's part in my life, and God needs to keep them coming. My prayer for myself and my family and for this church and circuit and each one of you is that we will always keep responding to that gracious invitation to be part of the life and work of God, and to know that we are precious, we are cherished, and we are loved. Amen.